Hello, welcome to day 3, and unfortunately our last day of e-commerce reimagined. We'll start as soon as I finish this preamble. You can see with my shared screen that we have another full day of presentations today, 16 in all, starting with my friend and friend of Radical, Dave Knox. We'll discuss how post-COVID all businesses really need to focus on predicting the turn. In the morning session, we'll hear from Morning Brew, Flow, GoPuff, Sezzle, Intern, Blueprint, and Basic Space. Then we'll chat with my friend Jeff Weiser, former CMO of Shopify, former CMO of Shutterstock, and get his thoughts on e-commerce and online marketing and what marketers should be focused on today. And then we've got another set of sessions in the afternoon. So I'm very much looking forward to another great day. Crossing my fingers that Hopin cooperates. Yesterday we were blessed with no glitches until the last session, which we've rescheduled to today. And I'm hoping and praying that Hopin works again today. So as I mentioned, our first session is with Dave Knox. I did mention Dave is a friend. He's going to discuss, what businesses need to be thinking about post-COVID. Dave Knox is a leading consultant. He's a speaker. He's a coach focused on innovation, marketing, and digital transformation. He has been asked by many of the world's leading companies to share his expertise. He's also an advisor to many innovative startups. He blends classic brand marketing acumen with an entrepreneurial instinct to navigate what is a changing and dynamic corporate landscape. And he's recognized throughout the industry as an innovator who bridges the worlds between brand marketing, digital, and entrepreneurship. Dave has a extensive background and a varied background that informs these perspectives. He was CMO of Rockfish and helped the company become one of the fastest growing agencies in the country, going from 8 million of revenues in 2010 to 70 by 2016. He co-founded the Brandery, one of the top 10 startup accelerators in the US. He's also the author of the best-selling Predicting the Turn, the high-stakes game of business between startups and blue. And he's also the owner of Nature's Willow. So it's a plug for Nature's Willow, Dave. So I'm going to hand it off to Dave now. I'm going to shut my screen down and we'll start the day.
Well, thank you for that great introduction, Stu. It's a pleasure to be with everyone this morning and getting to test out Hopin here and see how this works out. So I'm going to jump into the presentation and we will get going here. Alrighty. So what I want to talk to you today, as Stu kind of mentioned, is the concept of predicting the turn. And predicting the turn is a talk that for the last few years has been about the rise of startups and how industries are being transformed and changed and a lot of difference going on in industries. But as we've seen over the last 4 months, that's flipped on its head. And we have a new world that we're dealing with and a new way to kind of embrace and engage across the board. But what I'll say with all of this is it's not a new world. It's not a new world that we haven't been exposed, and there's parallels across it. Back when one of the first cases of SARS came out in 2003, a company called Alibaba, that we all know very well, was dealing with something similar. They had to deal with the Canton Trade Show in China in a decision whether or not to go or not go, and to really support their clients that they have. Ultimately, they end up going to the show and all their employees had to be quarantined, much like we're facing with now. But what you'll see in the world is that those opportunities can be created when you have those difficult situations. And in the case of Alibaba, one of the things they did is they wanted to make sure this would never happen, that they had to make a difficult decision. And they had their team of engineers be working on something that we now know as Taobao that launched on the 4th day of their quarantine. And the headline of the site on that day was think of those who start businesses in trying times. And I think that's the theme for all of us of how do we think about this engagement? How do we think about where our businesses need to change? And how do we think about what's being created out there because of this environment? The fact of the matter is technology isn't adopted just because it's available, whether it's adopted out of necessity. And think of the necessity that we're all experiencing today. Things like Hopin and Zoom and House Party aren't new. They weren't created in the last month or 2 months, but their adoption has exploded. And it's been exploded out of necessity, not just the thing that's been there and is out there. And it's a lesson we all need to keep in mind, because oftentimes we think about the thing we created being enough, but it's got to be what you do with it. Think about all of the changes that we have playing out right now. We have on one side some of the giants of retail seeing explosions of things that they had been embracing, but maybe consumers weren't. But you have Target seeing a 400% increase. You have things like DoorDash that are really kind of going away with the market from a food delivery standpoint and separating themselves from a crowded pack that existed. You have new interests emerging. Community-supported agriculture has seen searches on Yelp increase 400%. You see fitness equipment with that same kind of search. But then you see things like coffee roasters and wineries that you can't experience in this world right now that have seen a dramatic decline, obviously. What we're faced with is the fact that we have a new social era that's emerging. And what we're faced with is the fact that the technologies that help us work and live digitally are achieving a liftoff. And what that liftoff is they're moving from being just distractions, that thing that gives you escapism with Facebook or Twitter or something else, to being things that are part of the fabric of our lives, both our professional lives and our personal lives. So where predicting the turn used to be about fighting over market share, it was then about managing disruption. And where it used to be about changes in our industry, now it's about cascading changes in consumer behavior that are forcing industries to adopt or keep up or catch up in many cases. End of the day, there are decades when nothing happens. And as we've seen recently, there are weeks when decades happen. Predicting the turn is about this. When I originally wrote it, it was about this engagement with startups and big industries and what we needed to look at with changes that were taking place in industry. But what we're seeing is a new definition of what the turn is. It's easy in business to always talk about, checkers versus chess and those analysis of, well, I'm thinking a few moves ahead. But the problem is that's the wrong way to think about it. Because chess is a game where there's always the right move to make. There's always the exact percentage of, is it the right move to make at this very much moment in time. And that's why you can use a computer and create a award-winning chess move and beat any grandmaster out there. But what business is more like is like the game of poker. And that's where the concept of the turn comes from. Because business is about probabilities. There's a probability of it being the right move, the wrong move. You might have an 80% chance of something coming true. And what we need to be thinking about today is those probabilities. Because at the end of the day, no one knows what the new normal is going to be. You have plenty of futurists and other talking heads that are going to tell you exactly what it's going to be. But instead, we have probabilities. We have scenarios of where things may play out. How will behaviors that have changed today possibly be affected tomorrow? And it's the job of us all as business leaders to think about what that could be. The way I like to think about is taking inspiration actually from, of all things, forest fires. Nature has a way of thinking about rebirth. And when a forest fire reaches through a forest, what you see is actually the clearing of the ground. And what that does is create opportunities for sunlight and nutrients and everything else to give birth to new seeds. And what it really does is give the little guys room to grow. I think what we're going to watch over the coming years is that opportunity of people to have rebirth and to have companies of all sizes clear the underbrush and see what might be able to come out of it. Because at the end of the day, this happens. We have dealt with financial crises before, health scares and everything else. And in the world of businesses, that actually gave rise to some of the greatest companies. Over 50% of the Fortune 500 was founded during a recession or a bear stock market. Companies like GE and GM and Disney and FedEx, they gave birth to those companies during very trying times. And what we have today is tens of thousands of software engineers that are cooped up like all of us, getting frustrated with the things that they're using in their everyday life. That's going to create opportunity, because as all the companies you're seeing presented today, they started with an itch. They started with a desire to make something better that was often born out of a personal frustration with something. We're watching all of these engineers faced with that same thing, and we're going to see a lot of companies emerge that are solving the new environment that we're living with today. So what's a framework that we can think about very briefly to engage with this? Well, I'm going to talk really quickly about kind of 4 different areas. The first is this concept of venture capital as research and development. The startups that you've seen over the last 2 days and you're going to see over the rest of today are the canaries in the coal mine. They provide a clear picture of the competitive landscape, of validating companies, revealing trends, and more importantly, showing market opportunities that are out there. It's not about necessarily which company is going to be right or which one's going to be wrong, but can you take some inspiration of where the world is heading based on the very things that these startups are creating? One of my favorite examples that's emerged out of the whole pandemic is a company called Tock, which competes in the restaurant reservation space, just like OpenTable and others. And it was easy if you were Tock to look at your entire business go away when restaurants closed across the nation. But the interesting thing about Tock as a business is their co-founder is actually also the co-owner of a lot of restaurants, in particular, some of the best ones in Chicago. And what he saw was there was an inspiration that they could take their bottle and what their software offered, and with a few different tweaks, be able to launch what they call Tock to Go. And what Tock to Go does is allow, in the same way that you might reserve a table at a restaurant, you can actually reserve your meal slot to be able to get a delivery or a pickup or something of that nature. The result is Alinea, which is an amazing restaurant, $300 plus pre-fee type meals. They're now been able to do 75% of their pre-pandemic revenue by using something like Tock to Go. You also have a company like House that has been able to do this with what they've done with the restaurant project. Breaking into the alcohol space is a very, very difficult thing to do. And a lot of times it's actually the restaurants that can be some of the best endorsers of new brands and new industries. But the problem is that getting through and getting your bottle on shelf at one of those restaurants, you're fighting against regulation, distributors, 3-tier system, and everything else. House was able to partner up with some of the best restaurants in the world, create special SKUs that were inspired by their chefs and by their restaurants, and give those profits and proceeds back to the restaurants. That type of giving forward, type of mindset is one that's going to have lasting consequences. And it's one those restaurants are going to remember who stepped up for them in that moment of time. The next is the concept of Dominos. Dominos inspired by a guy named Lauren Whitehead, who was a nuclear physicist. And he had to explain the concept of a chain reaction in nuclear physics to a layman audience. And he used the concept of dominoes to do this, because what he knew is one domino could knock down another domino that was about 1.5 times its size. And if you played that out, starting with that small little domino, it would take 29 dominoes of ever increasing size to knock down the Empire State Building. Today, we're seeing an acceleration of those dominoes. Those little companies are becoming major, major players that are completely upending industries. But what we're also seeing is the second order consequences. It's really easy for us as business leaders to look at what's in front of us, what our competition is doing directly in our space. But what we don't pay enough attention to is the adjacencies. Where might we have a weakness or an opportunity on our supply chain, on our partners, or everything else that goes across it? Benedict Evans, who used to be an analyst or investor in Andreessen Horowitz, used the example of automobiles when he describes the concept of second order consequences. In automobiles, you have electrification and autonomous vehicles emerging. Well, what's that going to do to gas stations? And more importantly, what's it going to do to all those companies that rely on gas stations, whether it's Frito-Lay or Altria or others? Those are what second order consequences are. We've seen the emergence of live venues being something you have to evolve and merge into. ECRM is a great example of a live events that had to pivot, much like Radical is doing today. But we also see this emergence of artificial barriers that are going to be swept away. Think of all the things in our life that we just couldn't do for reasons that didn't make sense. Medicare didn't allow you to bill for telemedicine. HIPAA didn't permit Skype or FaceTime or email. We had a perception of what online college degrees might be, or why somebody might do homeschooling, usually for religious purposes or others. We've now seen all of those things be swept away. Which of those will change, and what are going to be the second order consequences of them? A great example is what happened during the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Print advertising in the US was pretty steady despite the emergence of digital in the early 2000s. But once businesses cut print advertising for the financial crisis, they never went back because they saw that it wasn't having a dramatic impact on growing their business by cutting that. So what's going to be the equivalent for us? Think about the percent of retail employees as a percentage of the labor force in the US. Think about US TV advertising. What's going to happen in a world where stores are shutting down or people are switching to streaming and not needing that TV advertising? Will those be reset in the same way? Total available market is the next concept. This is venture capital speak for how you change an industry. Many of the companies that you're watching today aren't trying to just steal 5% of another business. What they're trying to do is change the Y, not the X. And they're trying to reset what an industry even means. We're seeing this creation and destruction play out right now in COVID. 200% growth in orders placed online and picked up in store. But on the flip side, 90% of mall tenants weren't able to meet their rent payments in the months of April and May. And we've already seen bankruptcy after bankruptcy from JCPenney and Gold's Gym and Neiman Marcus. What's going to happen to the over-retailed landscape that we're faced with today? Webb Smith of 2PM, who you'll see a lot of his inspiration throughout the slides, he talked about this concept of 10 years versus 8 weeks, this permanent resetting that we might have watched in the retail landscape. That is the question of where will we go back and what's that going to look like going forward. And we're seeing a new definition of convenience commerce. Companies like Roadie or GoPuff that you'll see here in an hour or two that have redefined what convenience commerce looks like. The final concept is one of market intelligence. And this is for all the business leaders on the phone of what is the so what in this whole thing. It's about what do you do with this and how do you think and take all of the inspiration that you're learning from today and combining that. Because what we have to realize is the thing that we've watched over the last 3 to 4 months is a resetting of society and a resetting of the business tools. And more importantly, what we're seeing is a new infrastructure that has emerged. The tools that are being used to build businesses today are going to be the ones that give you a competitive advantage in the years to come. So you can't just turn to the way things have been done, but think about this new infrastructure of what you'll be using and what will be emerging. Just one simple example is what Disney has done with the release windows. The decision to move Hamilton up, to move movies like Onward and Frozen 2. Will that completely change what the engagement of entertainment looks like going forward for years to come? And what I'd encourage you to think about is this is about developing a sense of how and when the future will happen and sharing that foresight with key stakeholders throughout the corporation. This is the ability to see the future of your industry before it happens, and you can't miss this moment in time. So in conclusion, how do you predict the turn and what do you do with it? Well, I'd encourage first off, read what Mark Andreessen wrote with It's Time to Build. Building is going to be how we reboot the dream. And it's the job of all of us to support those builders. Support everyone that is out there building, trying, and really looking at change. Don't go back to just having your meetings and having your conference calls and doing the job of business, but get into the job of building in business. And take inspiration from the Fortune 500s that have stepped up. Think about what Ford did with taking ventilators and creating those out of the parts of an F-150. That's the building mindset that we need. And think about building around pain points. We are seeing all of these new things emerge, from distributed workforces to in-home fitness and social gaming and ed tech. What can be built around those? And what opportunities are going to come about? And what might be the second order consequences of those for your own business? The end of the day is we don't know what's going to happen. But what's important is that we have a thesis. Have a theory on where you think things are going to go. What are the probabilities of this happening or that happening? And start making steps in your businesses to address it. Try to figure out how you can take advantage of this opportunity to drive something meaningful and really move your business forward. And with that, I'll kind of end with a quote that I always have sitting in my office. You know, the sooner you stop fighting the present, the sooner you can get to work on figuring out the future. And the future is, I think, filled with amazing opportunities, but it's going to be opportunities for those of us that are willing to jump in, embrace it, instead of just thinking about what had been. So I thank you for the time, and I think we'll move into some Q&A now.
Dave, thank you for that great presentation.
I'm just glad it actually worked. I can see it going on.
It did work, yeah. Like, knock on wood. Don't count your chickens before the whole day has hatched, as they say. So a question for you about this environment. So you showed the slide from, or the chart from web. We've talked a little about the spike that everyone's seen in e-commerce penetration over the last few months. It's also talked about how it's not evenly distributed. So some businesses like Kroger, perhaps doing like very well online. Some businesses who sell luxury goods probably doing less well. But you know, in the longer term, more is going to be sold online than has been in the past. And most of the people in the audience have worked for companies who primarily sold mostly offline. Yeah. And selling online is a lot different than selling offline. And so one of the things that we're looking to explore here is, you know, how should they think about approaching these, you know, new markets? Maybe to start, you know, based on your experiences working at, you know, P&G and WPP, you know, when should they look to kind of partner with, you know, some of the startups here? When should they do things themselves, and how to balance, you know, leveraging your own kind of capabilities versus like seeking out those who may do it better?
Yeah. So I think it's a combination. You know, I think if one thing has been opened up, it's easy to say online versus offline and everything else. What this has showed us is the importance of omni-channel, and that if you are standing on one leg of a stool, you never know when that leg is going to get swept out from under you. So I think all businesses need to be thinking about alternative revenue streams and how do you diversify your business in how you go to market and how you engage with physical retail, click and collect, direct to consumer, you know, using the .coms of partners. You need to have all of those and be figuring it out and engaging. And then with that, I think it's also shown the importance of knowing those experts that can help you guide through this. You know, in this moment of time, those that have been laggards need to catch up really quickly. You don't have time to go spend building something that would take 1.5 or 2 years to build. You need to be in market with it now. And so a lot of the companies presenting today are your way to do that. Go embrace those companies, bring them involved, and use them to learn, because they know how to navigate this world. They know what's going to work on an Amazon page versus a direct to consumer page versus, you know, a .com page. Use that expertise and take advantage of it. And be very open to new types of partners. Your traditional, and I say this as a former agency guy, you know, your traditional agencies might be able to help you, but think about others and think about folks that can give you those new insights into it, because you need to be aware of what's changing. This landscape changes very quickly. I mean, 2 months ago, people thought Elliott was going to be one of the new exciting companies you could build your whole presence on. They're not in business anymore. You need to find those partners across the board.
Yep. Let's talk a little bit about what can be learned from some of these smaller, nimble companies. So not the tools and platforms we have here, but the direct-to-consumer businesses, the digitally native businesses. You own one. I guess it's an omni-channel business. What can big companies learn from how smaller companies are reacting to this environment?
Yeah, I think the agility is the biggest, and it's I think it's an easy thing to say, but what I mean by that is look at what happened in advertising over the last 3 months. In late March, as things started happening with COVID, those that were really in tune with the digital advertising space saw that rates started plummeting because of some of the big digital advertisers pulling out. The brands that really were in tune with that and were not just relying on their media plans that were already in place and that could jump into it were the ones that were able to really take leaps and bounds ahead because they could shift dollars, lean in, and swing for the fences during that time period. There were others, if you relied on your agency partners and you weren't really in tune with that daily media spend, you didn't even realize what was happening. So being that agility, but also looking and seeing that, then in May, when people start talking about that, those rates started going back up. So there's always this flux, and it just shows the such importance that you can't live off of media plans. You have to live off of really understanding your day-to-day business with that agility, kind of across the board. And that same thing applies to what people have had to do with their supply chains and others. And I think the final one is we've really focused a lot on specialization in business for a long time. And what this has opened up is the importance of business leaders being a deep understanding and a broad understanding in every part of their business. Because if you weren't knowledgeable enough with every part, you were going to get blindsided by stuff that you might not even realize was a problem. Knowing your supply chain, knowing these lead times, knowing all these things. The nimble, smaller companies, the founders by nature know that and have their hand a little bit in everything. And that gave them an unfair advantage to see where weakness might have been that the bigger companies might not even seen coming.
Yep. Awesome. Well, Dave, thank you very much for being here today. For everyone in the audience and registrants who are watching this on recorded video, we'll make Dave's presentation available to you all. And then at the end of the conference, as we've noted with other presenters, we'll create an opportunity for double opt-in connection. And so if you have an interest in speaking with Dave and having Dave speak to you and your colleagues, please reach out. And with that, Dave, thank you very much. And appreciate the time and have a great day.
Hey, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me as always. And I'll just say, anybody feel free to reach out. Double opt-in, not necessary. If you want to reach out, shoot me an email.
Single opt-in.
Yeah, single opt-in. I'm easy to find as Dave Knox online. So
yeah, I'm more of a triple opt-in, which means I never get connected.
There you go. I love it.
All right.
Well, good luck the rest of the day, my friend.
Thanks, Dave.